As I promised earlier, I'm going to now open it up for Q&As for the entire panel.
Okay, so this is for the entire panel. My question is, so we've been talking about immigration, and clearly, there's a lot of opinions out there, and it's a very polarized topic. You might be preaching to the choir in this room, but how would each of you recommend everyone else, just normal people, or even the most knowledgeable, philosophers, theorists, and politicians? How would you recommend that people engage in conversations from the different perspectives on immigration policy to come together to form some consensus with each other? How would each of you normatively describe how that conversation would take place?
Your microphones are live.
Oh, okay. I'll jump in first. So I think that just going off this last presentation, one of the most effective, and maybe this is just anecdotal, maybe it's my experience, but I think it's quite powerful to talk about how.
Those are for the video.
Yes, thanks. I think it's quite powerful just to talk about how difficult it is to immigrate, because I think if you could pick one misconception that people have about immigration law, and maybe you could back me up on this, or maybe I'm wrong, it's that people think that there's a line that you can join, and anyone who doesn't join the line is in violation of the law. So sort of very reasonably they say, why don't they just follow the law, and then everything would be fine. And just trying to communicate the fact that, well, wait a minute, and maybe it didn't fully come across, but if you're not part of one of these groups, there is no line. Even if you are part of one of these groups, what are you saying? Like, it could be decades. Right. And just to because if say I live in Haiti and I want to immigrate to the United States, it's not like, oh, I just joined the line and then I'll be able to immigrate. No, I literally can't ever. So I think that you need to fight against this. Oh, I'm pro-immigration. I'm just anti-illegal immigration, and because people feel very confident in that stance, and say, wait a minute, okay, so then are you pro-expanding legal immigration? Are you interested in raising this cap? Are you interested in building a door? And because they feel confident in their position of there is a procedure to become an American or to at least be here legally, and the people who are in violation of it are criminals who are out of line, and that's not the case, right?
If I could add to that, I think that's exactly right. That one of the I don't know if this is on. Can you all hear me through the microphone? Okay, great. So I definitely agree that that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions in immigration law and policy is that there's a magical line that people can just join. It'll take like 10 minutes, and then they'll become citizens. Not true. So sharing what you know about the law and how it works with people who may not understand it as well. But to maybe add a little bit more, I guess I have kind of a philosophical answer as well as a strategic answer. So we'll start philosophically, is to really challenge, think critically, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir, think critically about and challenge the presuppositions that are underpinning our current system, right? To ask ourselves, or to not simply accept that just because that's the way it is the way it should be. Separate the normative from the descriptive. Because I think once we box ourselves into having a conversation around what current policy looks like, then we've already lost the full spectrum of justifications and ethical considerations that Shelley so wonderfully described. And so that's something we can do to improve our own or to fine tune our own positions on this very challenging issue. To not just think, well, how can we expand the cap when maybe we should be asking, well, should there be a cap, right? To kind of think broader. That's for ourselves. I think strategically, it may not make that much sense for someone who's very anti-immigrant to tell them, well, why don't we just have open borders, right? And here's what Walzer says about it. And here's what Punic, is that? Sorry, the various philosophers that were described earlier. I wrote them down, but I can't read my own handwriting. So strategically, I think if we're trying to move someone, if we're trying to persuade someone, or at least get them thinking a little more than a little broader about the issue, strategically, I think the immigrant rights movement tells us a lot, and that is start with the most sympathetic cases, right? So 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, the Dreamer movement really focused on this idea that if people, this really grave sympathetic injustice, this grave injustice that evokes a lot of sympathy for people who were brought to the United States at a very young age, have not committed any crimes, have basically been living as Americans, and to simply have them deported from the country, that is, I think, something that even the most ardent anti-immigrant person would probably find some sympathy for. And so what the immigrant rights movement did is start with that as the negotiating position and say, why should these people be deported? And from there, rights and benefits, or rights have been building. So that's how we got DACA, and that's how there were proposals to expand DACA. And I think it's a slow process, but strategically, you start with what's the most sympathetic. And I think we are at a point now in the conversation, at least in some circles, specifically more liberal circles, where people are saying, well, why should we even have deportations at all? So to move from dreamers shouldn't be deported to nobody should be deported is not a logical leap that can happen overnight for someone, especially if they're very anti-immigrant. But to think about who you're talking to and what types of arguments they'll find the most persuasive, and it may not be the arguments that we discussed today by philosophers that are kind of out of touch from what people are maybe thinking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think when I think of success that I've had in encouraging people to expand their thinking around the issue, I think about the sympathetic case. I've had success with that, and I actually think about that a bit in the same way that it functioned. Is this better? Thank you. When I was trying to convince, for instance, my father that LBGT individuals should have municipal anti-discrimination policy, I started from the fact that he knows and loves a queer person. And I asked him to think about it from the perspective as being a father rather than an abstract person who was arguing on the basis of some abstract premises. I can make the same kind of argument with my father because he lives in SoCal. So that I think is another way to start with sympathetic cases, not just classes of migrants, but also individuals, because everybody, obviously the reality is, right, that our communities are fundamentally made up of people with varying migration status, all communities. I also find that if I'm going to try to make a philosophical argument, I might very subtly, right, it's hard to do because people are really defensive around these issues, I think in part because they can't answer the question that I'm about to suggest asking. I think also, right, sadly, debates about migration are also debates about race. Sometimes they're debates about gender, they're debates about class. And the uglier commitments often lurk below the surface. So it's hard to have the discussion even in philosophical terms, not only because it's abstract, but also people don't want to be all the time aware or honest about what's really bothering them about migration. So that being said, I've actually had success just subtly, sweetly asking people why it is citizens who are committed to restrictive policies, why they think that they have a moral right to be here. And at the end of the day, what I initially was found so philosophically eye-opening was this basic, just obvious fact that we are born where we are born by virtue of luck alone. And if we have a kind of view of what justice is that claims that people shouldn't be, that benefits and burdens shouldn't be distributed on the basis of luck, right? That that people who happen to be lucky enough to be born into a rich family, they should have the same opportunities as people who happen to be born into a less wealthy family. If we buy into that, if we endorse that kind of theory of justice, and we also are willing to admit that where we're born is a matter of luck, then that does give us a pretty powerful way of challenging, I think, people's kind of knee-jerk commitment or attachment to the view that we have a right to restrict. Thanks. It's a great question.
Yeah.
Shelley, in your talk, when you were talking about Balser, you mentioned, that Representative Im is having some of the more conservative views about immigration, and then mentioned that later on that, even he agreed with a great deal of sort of more liberal views about it. What do you have to say to somebody like Jonathan Haidt, who would say that, well, okay, yeah, that we in the academy we don't really experience very many well-articulated conservative views on the subject. I mean, the academy is just very left-wing. So
I'd ask him what his argument is.
Right, but I mean, I think at some point you said, look, I mean, even the most conservative person here agrees with this, but maybe we're just not hearing the arguments of the most conservative people.
That could be. I mean, I'd ask you, it's probably true that we are hearing, I think, the most conservative arguments from philosophers. There are claims that are being made at the national level that are more conservative, right? But we would need to see the argument in order to have a discussion about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. So just the general question would be, are there really serious people making far more conservative arguments that we need to
Yeah. So there may be, I think part of the issue, especially when we're talking in the academic context and the philosophical context, philosophers are, they're staking out their scope around liberal democratic values. So the question is, what sorts of migration policies are appropriate for liberal democracies? And that limits the kind of arguments they can make. Outside of that realm, there's certainly a big range of arguments that could be made from just straight up arguments about state power or something, but they're not using liberal democratic values. So those kinds of arguments are there, but they're giving away, they're not even operating within the philosophical context of liberal kind of democratic values or liberal political philosophy. And there aren't that many. I mean, there are libertarians, but of course, and they're in some people's view very conservative, right, on a lot of issues. They're extremely permissive on migration, but they're still operating within this liberal framework. So you'd have to say, what would a fascist say about migration? It's true, yeah, academics aren't really talking about that. We might start talking about that, but just the development of the field has been within the context of liberal democratic states.
In part response to that, I was troubled recently by an argument by Stiglitz that one of the real negative effects with immigration at present is that it's a brain drain that is actively harming other countries.
Yeah.
So for economic immigration, it's a drop in the bucket. It's part of the argument. And the other part of the argument is we're taking away the very people who would do the most benefits to the country that we're taking them away from, even if we gain. Is there any responses to? I don't know.
Yeah, so I would recommend a book called Debating Brain Drain. That's in Oxford's new OUP book. It's Michael Blake debates Gillian, what is her last name? I'll think of it in Brock. And they're both pretty mainstream liberal philosophers. They're both sympathetic to global justice claims. Neither one takes the state has a right to impose some kind of penalty or tax or some redistributive function or mechanism for people when people migrate from the global south to the global north in certain skilled positions. That's Brock's view. Blake thinks that's always coercion. So they are probably more philosophical than Stiglitz. They're not saying, nobody that I've read says individuals should be banned. Like the state has a right to restrict immigration on the basis of brain drain arguments, but they do argue, at least Brock argues, that the loss to the sending community is significant enough that some redistribution is morally permissible. And she usually talks about it in terms of a tax. Then the question is, should the tax be on the people who migrate, or should the tax be on the receiving society somehow to be taken back to basically repay for education and the social capital and the resources that enable the person to have the nursing skills or whatever it is to benefit the receiving country. So I think it's really, really interesting, and that book also, it's a little superficial, but it has a really great bibliography too, if you're interested.
So the brain drain argument comes up a lot in economics literature. And my reaction to it every time is, and this is not like a strictly economic reaction. Maybe this is just like my personal ethical reaction to it, is that the economy of Haiti would really benefit from almost any of us moving there. Okay, so would it be right to force us to move there in order to help the economy? I think that violates the moral intuitions of almost every person. So I've never understood how that is even an argument. Maybe I'm taking a really extreme position up here, but to say like you can't leave this place because we benefit from your mind being here, just seems strange to me. But
Can I say one more thing? Do you mind? Okay, I agree that emigration is different from imposing some kind of redistributive mechanism scheme, right? And I actually am somewhat motivated by the history of colonialism in which the global north has benefited by extracting resources from the global south, which has promoted the development of this global economic order that continues to advantage the global north. And I think that brain drain can be understood in that context, and especially if you think about the ways in which brain drain could enable the extraction of social capital resources in the form of education. Also, right, there's the brain drain debate. There's also a care drain debate where people are arguing along the same kinds of lines about the number of nannies and domestic workers and childcare workers and caregivers and that are also migrating to service the needs of the global north. And there we talk about it in terms of externalizing the social costs of reproduction. And so I don't think ever should a liberal state, a liberal democratic state, have the right to prevent its citizens from leaving for any reason? No. But should we understand these issues in the historical context in which they have arisen? Yeah, I think so. And then I do think the global north is getting off pretty cheaply if it can get the global south to to bear all the social costs for our caretaking and a lot of our skilled labor. So I see it in that context as well.
Do you think this is realistic? A lot of the 11 million undocumented work in food, agriculture, and slaughterhouses. And everybody likes to eat. And I think I'm correct in thinking that minimum wage laws don't apply to undocumented, right?
They do apply.
They do apply?
So they're supposed to.
Well,
Enforcement's a different issue, but they're
Yeah.
supposed
It
to
seems to
apply.
be the political handle that people could use, liberals. Everybody likes to eat. We ought to pay these people a decent wage, which we don't. And that would reduce the undocumented's misery tremendously. There's that fantasy.
I'm going to look to the economist for this.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe I don't like fully understand your question. You say that people could use. So the people who are talking the most about minimum wage and applying it more strictly, because it does apply legally does apply, but trying to enforce it are anti-immigrationists. The idea being that if you were to strictly enforce these minimum wage laws for everyone, including undocumented immigrants, that's going to drive prices up. And it kind of plays to this idea that people see undocumented immigrants, if they are receiving less than minimum wage, as driving wages down for people who are citizens, and that they're trying to basically break the law and circumvent the law in various ways, other than just the fact that they're not citizens. So that's where most of that is coming from. And if they were to enforce minimum wage legislation more strictly, that would reduce that reason for people to want to move here in many cases, because many people are moving here to get jobs, and they realize that part of one of the strengths of their labor is that they're willing to work for a lower wage. So I do think that the anti-immigration people are right in this case, that if you were to more strictly enforce minimum wage laws, you would see less immigration, and you would see higher prices for food. So I'm not sure who's really benefiting other than low-skilled laborers who are U.S. citizens, who, as I mentioned in my talk, are the people who have been harmed the most by immigration so far.
I was kind of trying to get at the idea that for the average citizen, they don't think about undocumented people at all. You don't affect their lives directly. But they like to eat, and so indirectly,
Yeah, that's
they're
right.
very important. And I'm trying to think of something that would persuade a larger part of the public of, gee, maybe we got to do something about this. One of them would be paying them more who grow our food and slaughter the meat for the carnivores and all that stuff. But I don't know. It's hard to find out ways to change the system.
Maybe one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question yet.
The sacrificial lamb right now. Okay, so my question is going to go a little bit backwards towards citizenship. It's always bugged me when we talk about it in social and philosophical context. We talk about citizenship, and I always wonder, what do you mean when you think citizenship? Because when I try to think of citizenship, I always end up overthinking citizenship, and then I go, well, it's a group of people in a certain area that have lived there for a while, and they have certain social norms that they agree to, and they each have like a sort of group collective ethical or moral prospects. But then what if somebody moves away for 6 years and they go to a different country and then they start developing connection with that country, and they move back? Are they still a citizen? They've changed now. So what is your definition of citizenship? Well, how would you apply the definition of citizenship to the issue of immigration? Because if it's simply just residing within the borders of some country, then there really wouldn't be a problem of undocumented citizens because they would be citizens. My question is, how would each one of you define citizenship?
Yeah.
And
Well, I can acknowledge that the question of what conception of citizenship we ought to endorse, that question is very thorny. And I actually started, I worked my way to questions about territorial admissions and borders by way of just this question. I actually wrote my dissertation on admission to citizenship rather than on territorial admissions. And there are a lot of, you could see citizenship as just a status, like you're suggesting. You could see it as a really thick conception of citizenship, like someone like Walzer is going to have a thicker conception that involves more about shared understandings and identity of this political community. There are also nationalists who argue that on the kind of extreme end, right, that citizenship ought to align with nationality. And on one view within the nationalist, under that umbrella, that national community is defined in terms of sort of ethnic blood relationship. Then there are others who try to have more liberal kinds of views, or views that are consistent with liberalism, and they would say, look, liberal values are, it's antithetical, that kind of ethnic nationalism is antithetical to liberalism because it is a matter of sheer luck. There's no way to become a citizen. It doesn't have anything to do with any kind of commitment to the state, but sort of at its foundations, liberals like to tell themselves a story that the way that state power is justified is because we've all consented to it. But if you're an ethnic national, you don't really get that. So they try to come up with other conceptions of citizenship. It's just about a commitment to a bunch of political values, and that's supposed to be separable from ethnic nationalism. At the end of the day, I think that most of those kinds of civic national sorts of conceptions, they reduce to some kind of racial or ethnic understanding in practice. So when I think about citizenship, I think about it as a legal status that entitles one to certain rights and obligates one to certain benefit. Entitles us to rights and benefits, obligates us to certain duties or certain obligations. And then the question is, what should anyone have to do, right, to get that thing? And in order to answer that question, you have to always keep in mind that a big group of people got it for free, just by nothing, right? Just by being born there. And so that then makes the argument about having to do like really special things to get it really hard to make. And essentially, I think it comes down to the fact that we are members of a society. And it does not make sense to have a government that has authority over us without us all having equal access, political access to that government. And so we're all, by virtue of living, having families, having jobs, walking down the street, coming here, we're all members of the society. And all members of a liberal democratic society should have access to citizenship. And it doesn't matter how you got here. You know, there might be something about how long people have been here. You know, 1 day as opposed to 2 years, right? Is going to be a difference. But once one becomes a member of society, one has a claim to citizenship, in my view. But I can make that argument because I don't have a really thick vision of and I don't have a nationalist vision of what citizenship is about.
Yeah, I think I would pretty much just echo actually what Shelley said. I think for me to kind of maybe elaborate just a little more, when I think about citizenship and what it is, just I guess descriptively, I think of it's a legal fiction that we use to kind of serve as this gate, right? That has this gatekeeper role, that a legal fiction from which rights, benefits, obligations flow. And It's interesting to me because if we're really thinking about who should have certain responsibilities or who should have certain rights, it is kind of arbitrary that it's based on where you're born or whether you can apply it. You have a family member that's over 21. You know, like we create all these legal, and what I mean by legal fiction is like, you know, speed limit 65 because we say 65 is where, you know, someone starts becoming a dangerous, you know, person to other people on the highway. Not 64, but 65, right? So we set up all these things in the law, these kind of arbitrary boundaries to regulate the way that we act and the benefits that we get. And I think with citizenship, it's one of these really ingrained legal fictions that we have from which rights, benefits, obligations flow. And a more flexible, perhaps more sensical conceptualization would be simply who is in your political community, right? And asking the questions of who should be based on not necessarily where you were born, but what makes a person someone you would call a fellow member of your political community. And I think if we ask it that way, then the conceptualization of citizenship is probably easier to justify than in its current form.
Not sure how much I have to add to that, to the discussion of what is a citizen. But I did want to say that, and maybe I'm breaking with many people in the room here, but I think that there's too much made of citizenship in this discussion. Surveys of immigrants asking them, like, how much do you care about various reforms that could be made, show that desire for citizenship is quite low. And I mean, at least in the short term. And that makes total sense to me because you've got other concerns that are greater. Like I don't want to be deported. Okay, I don't want to, like, whether or not I can vote in my local school board election is like way down on the list of my priorities. At the top is, can I live here and not be put in jail? Can I send my kids to school? Can I work? Okay, most immigrants want to work. They want to provide for their families. Citizenship is like way down on the list of priorities. And I think that makes sense. And I think that it should give us a hint of how we should approach reform and focus, you know, like a lot of my own work has been on trying to push for expansions of work permits and just reducing the reducing enforcement or reducing reducing deportations and not expanding citizenship. I think that expanding citizenship should be low on our list of priorities, and that high on the list of priorities should be protecting people from being deported, letting them continue to work and live here unmolested. And that would actually not only satisfy a lot of our moral duty, but it's basically what the immigrants want, at least according to what I've seen in terms of polling. I think it would also reduce some of the pushback that we see from people who claim, and this is something that hasn't really come up in our discussion today, but claim that the main reason why they want to limit immigration is because they want to protect existing institutions. For instance, you say, well, look, if we let everyone from Venezuela is terrible. And if we let everyone from Venezuela move here and vote, then they're going to turn the United States into Venezuela. And we don't want that to happen. Okay? So protecting institutions is a big part of that discussion. But that is completely separate from all these other issues we're talking about, like, can they live here? Can they work here? Can they own a house? Can they go to school? They're caught up in this citizenship idea and can they vote? Can they run for office? And I think that we should separate the issues, but I probably am in a minority because a lot of people say, no, then you're just creating a second-class citizenry, and we're against that. But I think that leaves us in this situation where many people who would be okay with people working here and living here and being part of our communities, they just don't want to give people full citizenship, and we're kind of removing that option from the table, and I think that's a strategic mistake.
So I think that's all the time we have left for the Q&A. I did want to give the panel a final opportunity to say something, if there was something left to say. Any final remarks?
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you all for sticking around with us for the whole period of time.
Well, let's thank the panelists for also